testimony of Senator McGovern, and please apologize. I see him here right now, and I apologize in advance to Senator McGovern.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Dr. Brzezinski, very much indeed for your testimony, and it was excellent, and we benefited and enjoyed and derived much benefit from it. Thank you
very much. Thank you.
Our next witness, I'm happy to say, is an old friend. Thank you. President McGovern. I mean, almost President McGovern. Senator McGovern. And we welcome him here. And I recall our years of service together very well indeed, and know how the esteem and regard I had for him in the Vietnam days. Those were the days when those who were had the best war records were those who opposed the war the most vigorously. And men like Senator McGovern and Senator Inouye and others who had really terrific war records were those who really called the shots on the faults of Vietnam early. And I've noticed that through the years that those who've fought tough wars are usually those who oppose war the most. So I welcome you here very much indeed, Senator McGovern.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, for including me in these hearings. And I'm also delighted that I arrived in time to hear Dr. Brzezinski's testimony. I thought it to be one of the most profound and compelling statements we've had during this entire Iraqi crisis. And surprisingly, I found myself in almost full agreement with what he had to say, with the possible exception of his opening confession that he had supported President Bush in the 1988 presidential election. I've had a rather firm tendency over the last 20 years to support the losers in presidential campaigns. But like Dr. Brzezinski, I would not want my views to be interpreted as motivated either by political or ideological bias. Let me say right at the outset, as did Dr. Brzezinski, that I support the President's leadership at the United Nations and here at home and around the world to invoke international sanctions against Saddam Hussein. I think that's the most powerful weapon we have. I even supported the deployment of forces in Saudi Arabia as a deterrent against a possible move by Iraq into Saudi Arabia, although I think we have vastly too many forces in Saudi Arabia for that purpose, and that the proportion of Americans to the other forces is out of line. Both the excess of forces in Saudi Arabia and the disproportionate number of Americans would, of course, be greatly aggravated if we were to move ahead with the President's proposal to send in another 200,000 Americans. But I do think the evidence is growing that the sanctions are working, and that this is the tool we ought to depend upon rather than rushing off to war. I'm very proud of this committee, Mr. Chairman, for scheduling these hearings and raising some of the hard questions that need to be raised in evaluating whether or not it makes sense for the United States to go to war in the Persian Gulf, just as I'm proud of Senator Nunn and his committee on armed services. And I think if war is averted in the Persian Gulf, a matter that I would regard as a disaster, that considerable credit ought to go to you and the members of your committee and the members of the Armed Services Committee and other congressional committees for raising some of the difficult questions that need to be evaluated. The first point that I would like to emphasize today, and I'm going to try to make my statement brief, is that it is highly important for the Congress to reclaim its constitutional authority to decide whether or not the nation goes to war. At the very least, Congress has an obligation to raise the hard questions that this committee is capable of pursuing. After 18 years' service in the United States Senate, if I were allowed to change just one of the thousands of roll call votes that I cast in this body, the one I would change is my reluctant vote in support of the Gulf of Tonkin resolution.
I share the same emotion and same thought.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. That resolution, opposed only by the late Senator Graining and the late Senator Morris, and God bless them for that, was a surrender in advance of the constitutional war power of the Congress. It was a blank check to the President under circumstances which seemed politically compelling at the time. But I'm embarrassed to recall how Congress was manipulated and misled by a president who would have been far better served if Congress had been more determined to follow the Constitution. More importantly, the nation would have been better served by a Congress with a greater sense of constitutional responsibility for the young people we consigned to death and misery in Vietnam, hundreds of thousands of whom are still suffering from that experience. Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution states that the Congress shall have the power to declare war, to raise and support armies, to provide and maintain a navy, to make rules for the government and regulation of the land and naval forces. The constitutional power to decide the issue of war or peace resides with the Congress. Article 2, Section 2 of the Constitution states that the President shall be Commander-in-Chief of the Army and the Navy of the United States. But to command the armed forces either in peace or war does not give the President authority to launch a war without congressional approval. Only the Congress has that power. By well-established precedent, the President has claimed the power to repel an attack against our armed forces or against our civilian population. And although that power is not spelled out in the Constitution, I think no one any longer disputes it. If U.S. forces or American civilians are attacked in Saudi Arabia or any place else, the President may order our forces to respond, and no citizen will question that power. Since World War II, however, it has also been argued that in the nuclear age of intercontinental missiles and supersonic bombers, there is no longer time for congressional investigation, debate, evaluation, and a declaration of war. To paraphrase the late H.L. Mencken, there is some logic in that contention, but not much. The Founding Fathers greatly feared giving a single individual the power to take the nation into war. They might have been even more fearful of assigning this power to a single individual with weapons powerful enough to erase all life from this planet. But even if one were to concede that in the nuclear age there might be conditions that preclude congressional debate and a declaration of war, obviously no such conditions prevail relative to the current crisis in the Persian Gulf. There is ample time for Congress to investigate, study, and evaluate U.S. interests in the Persian Gulf, and whether those interests are best served by a presidential order sending hundreds of thousands of young Americans into war. There is ample time to call on the best authorities on the Middle East. Mr. Chairman, I was startled and appalled when Senator Sarbanes was here to discover that a number of the distinguished witnesses that have been called to give their expertise to this committee have not been consulted by the administration. There is ample time to engage the most experienced and respected military minds. There is ample time to evaluate the costs of war in the Arabian Desert and the Persian Gulf against the benefits of such a war. And this leads me, Mr. Chairman, to the second point I wish to stress today, which builds on the fact that now Congress insists on a benefit cost analysis before authorizing public works projects, a dam, a water development program, irrigation, or something of that kind. I would suggest a careful benefit cost analysis of war in the Middle East before we embark on this course. What are the benefits that would offset the cost of, let us say, 10,000 to 50,000 young American lives, plus 25,000 legs and arms, 5 or 10,000 pairs of eyes, 15,000 lungs, and thousands of hands and feet and kidneys and stomachs, testicles, spines, and faces, and all the other tragedy that goes with war of this kind? How valuable are 1,000 or more American hostages? What is the worth of a generation of Iraqi infants and children, plus the young fighting men of Iraq and of our own allies? There is time for Congress to consider these things and others. What, for example, would be the situation if President Bush ordered an attack on Iraq and Saddam Hussein responded by a rocket attack on Israel, as he has indicated he would? I've been told by leading students of the Middle East that if the United States were to find itself allied with the Arab monarchists and Israel on one side against the Arabs of Iraq, 90% of rank-and-file Arabs, most of them living in poverty, some 200 million strong, would join the cause of Saddam Hussein. Have we carefully considered the danger of 500,000 young Americans being caught in the crossfire of a holy war, pitting Israeli against Arab, Jew against Muslim, impoverished Arabs against the ruling oil-rich families that we seek to defend? There are other dangers and costs of a war in the Middle East. The loss of oil production and rising prices for months to come. The loss of the so-called peace dividend at a time when our society cries out for more constructive government. The further deepening of our national debt burden. The postponement of action in other fronts, including Eastern Europe, the Soviet Union, Central America, and Africa. Specifically, Mr. Chairman, there is time to evaluate the economic sanctions against Iraq. But there will not be time to do so if we go to war on January 15th. That action will soon teach us whether or not war is a workable solution, but a war begun on or shortly after January 15th will rob us forever of the capacity to measure the effectiveness of collective security by means of international sanctions against aggression. When President Bush invoked sanctions last August, 3.5 months ago, he said that it might be 6 months to a year before sanctions could become effective. Why then the rush to war? Why 200,000 more troops in Saudi Arabia? Why not give the sanctions a chance before sending our youth into a war for which they show their enthusiasm by declining enlistment rates over the last few months? This committee was wise in scheduling testimony of a sanctions expert in yesterday's hearing. I understand that he testified that the sanctions are beginning to work and that they will work even more effectively with the passage of time if our leaders have the courage and the patience to permit them to work. I do not challenge the President's successful effort in securing the approval of the United Nations Security Council for military action after January 15th, but there should be no haste in exercising that authority. It should be seen as a standby authority to be considered seriously only if all else fails after a reasonable period of time. Instead of eyeing the spring weather of Saudi Arabia or the religious ceremonies of that country on the calendar, let us determine the issues of war and peace on the basis of our constitutional procedures, our carefully evaluated national interest, and the well-being of the young Americans whose lives are on the line. no senator and no president should authorize war in the Arabian desert until he has asked himself this question: is this issue so compelling that I would give my own life or that of my children to resolve it by force of arms? I support economic sanctions against Saddam Hussein. I support all available diplomatic pressure to bring about his withdrawal from Kuwait, and in that sense I applaud the President's decision to send Secretary Baker to Baghdad and to invite the Iraqi foreign minister here. But I see no American interest in all of this that is sufficiently great to justify the sacrifice of my life, or far more importantly, the lives of my 4 grandsons of military age. So thank you, Mr. Chairman, for considering these concerns of a former colleague and a present grandfather.
Thank you very much indeed, and I share your thoughts in this regard and your knowledge of the abhorrence of war. Came back not wounded but ill in a hospital ship in World War II, and you saw the remainders there of violence. And when you saw a shipload of young men all in hideous medical condition, you realize the damage that war does. I appreciate your coming here very much indeed, and your willingness to be here, and thank you very much.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Pressler asked me to respond to a question, even though you were not here, and that is what I regard as the central lesson of Vietnam. There are many lessons of that disastrous war, but I think, just to put it in a nutshell, the lesson of Vietnam is do not commit American forces to war unless our national interest is so clearly involved that there's no confusing it, and that we have no other reasonable alternative.
I wonder if you would take agree with a slight change there. It's not a national interest that's really involved, it's a national security. Our national interest can be an economic interest or other things, and war is not worth going to for just a national interest. But it's when our security is at stake, then war would be justified.
Yes, I think that's essentially right. It's quite clear that our national interest was not on the line in Vietnam, and that's demonstrated by the fact that we lost the war, and yet no fundamental American interest has been lost by that defeat. No fundamental American interest, therefore, would have been lost if we had never intervened in Vietnam. We would have saved the lives of nearly 60,000 young Americans. We would have saved several hundred billions of dollars. We would have